When you look through the first three servant texts in the book of Isaiah, the future actually looks very, very bright. There is light at the end of the tunnel, according to the prophet Isaiah. But with the fourth servant song, beginning in chapter 52, covering chapter 53, there is an unexpected surprise. There is a turn of events in which the one servant will face rejection, suffering, and death. So how can the servant restore Israel and lead Israel to complete its mission in the world, as we have heard about, if the whole thing ends in death? Is this servant that we meet in chapter 53 a different one from the one we have been meeting in the preceding three texts? Or is he talking about somewhat completely different? Let's read the first text. It says, "See, my servant will prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance." So despite suffering and humiliation, according to this text, this servant will eventually be greatly exalted. That's what you have in the preamble here. And we further read, So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouth because of him. For what had not been told them they shall see, and that which they have not heard of they shall contemplate. In other words, whoever the servant here is, his impact will be global. I think we should first notice this. He shall startle the many nations. His influence, or what happens, will be worldwide. One more time, we just have to do that again. After the text, his impact will be global. According to this text, his impact will be global. His achievements will be surprising, it will be startling, and it will even be game-changing for the world. This is big. So, the text, before we read it, we should actually look at the text before we actually read it. It will divide into three major sections. The preamble will talk about his exaltation, his humiliation, and the outcome and rationale for this. The first main text will develop the theme of the servant's humiliation, explaining its deeper rationale, and namely the human sin problem. We'll come to that. The second part of the text will talk about his exaltation, explaining its deeper rationale, namely the servant's successful resolution of the universal problem between God and man, the sin problem, through an intercessory act of atonement. We'll come to that. Even the preamble itself will make it clear that the exaltation is preceded by his humiliation. So I think this is what the text is. Now, the theme of humiliation will go like this, and that's what we are going to look at now. This is the first main text that begins with a surprise. We read, "Who has believed what we have heard? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." So the servant is identified again by a botanical imagery, an imagery that has been used before in the Isaiah texts, and it was a code word for the Davidic dynasty. So we already have the code breaker's manual in the book itself. So just go back in the text and you will know what he's talking about when he talks about this botanical imagery. Now, he uses the word shoot, root, branch, and we have heard that before as a reference to the stump of Jesse. So there is a verbal and a thematic connection to the preceding text. It's very, very strong. And that connection is reinforced by the observation that the servant does not have all the trimmings of royalty. We notice that, as could have been expected. And he is rejected and will be treated accordingly. As we read, he was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with infirmity. As one whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Now, this servant is not the first to be despised or even experience this kind of rejection and treatment. Actually, David in his day was the stone rejected by the builders, as he says himself. For many years he suffered. He was hunted like a wild animal by King Saul, and he lived as a fugitive before he became a king. So this servant is not the first one. King David had a similar experience. But the servant is not just rejected. He is met with extreme violence and even hostility as we further read. And we need to note that. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep before its shears is silent. By perversion of justice he was taken away. So when we read these texts, we realize that whoever the servant is, he is actually subject of a very active mistreatment, violence, even a complete miscarriage of justice. We have heard about show trials. Well, here it is. Violent death is even in the pipeline here. It is stated at least 5 times in this servant text that the servant will die from his mistreatments. And we read something like here, for he was cut off from the land of the living. That usually means you're dead. They made his grave with the wicked and a tomb with the rich. When you put people there, they are supposed to have died. Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. The bottom line in this text is that the servant had done no crime that deserved this kind of treatment. I think we need to notice that when we analyze the text. He was described as a non-violent when you read the text. He was peaceful. He was also truthful. Actually, God calls him my righteous servant. So here it is. The entire servant text described the violent treatment that this servant is being treated with words like this. Here they are summed up. He was oppressed. He was afflicted. He was bruised. And they say he was cut off. He was crushed, he was stricken, he was struck down. We would today describe this kind of treatment as, we would describe this kind of person as being victim of torture, wouldn't we? This is what we would do. As we read, so marred, that's the introduction, was his appearance beyond human semblance and his form beyond that of mortals. A victim of torture. I think this is the bottom line of the story here. Whoever he is, whatever is going on here, he is a victim of torture. Now that's the reason why nobody wanted to look at the result of that. It has been horrible view, and at least this is the description. None of us would like to look at that. So who is this servant? And before we close, we also poses another question. Why should he die? Why would God allow a thing like this to happen? to an innocent, righteous person. If he is indeed the one who is destined to restore Israel, who is destined to bring Israel back to God, and who is destined to lead Israel out in the fulfillment of their mission to the world, how can he do that if he's dead? But before we pause to consider that issue, I think we should ask another question. But as we pause to consider these questions, I think we should take a look at the rationale for the servant's death. Now, the surprising, I would say even startling, rationale is given as we read. You haven't read anything like that before. It says, "He was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray." Now, again, the fact is that he is a victim of torture. It's highlighted by words like wounded and bruised. It's clear. But more importantly, the text keeps repeating that all of this happens for the benefit of everybody else. I want you to notice this. Words like sin, iniquity, transgressions, infirmities, and going astray. Now, these are, if we have been tracking with the story from the very beginning, we remember that these are the words that we have met before in the story. They are simply the code word. The code-breaking manual is actually there in the pre-story. It tells us very much that it's a reference to human natural inclination to evil. We have met that in the preceding story. They are not new concepts. Especially the word iniquity is mentioned 3 times in this servant text, and the word transgression is used 4 times. So the focus is clear. They are the very code words in the preceding story for the evil state of the human mind and the evil bent of the human mind that alienates us and excludes us from having any communion and life with God at all. The startling thing is that the servant of the Lord here is seen as being judged for the iniquity of everybody else and for the transgression of everybody else. And that judgment at the end of the day is for the benefit of everybody else. Now, this is the plot, and we need to unravel it. So how is God involved in all of this? For involved he is, for we read the following shocking statement. "And the Lord laid on him the iniquities of us all. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him with pain." When you make his life an offering for sin. Does this sound like some kind of cosmic child abuse, as some critics claim? Or is God simply executing an innocent in place of the guilty? It could sound like that. A gross abuse of justice, you would say. Some have been arguing this, and they are very adamant that this is the recipe of the worst abuse of justice that the universe has ever heard of. Now, the language, we should pause for a moment and simply say the language is that of the Israelite sanctuary. It should be noted. And the Israelite worship that was instituted at the time of the covenant at Sinai. This is the language where God provided a sacrifice for sin and the sinner. Now we read a word like this: "You make his life an offering of sin." This is sanctuary language. And we have no way of understanding what the author of this text is up to if we do not understand this quote. And the quote should I say, the code word or the code-breaking manual is actually in the preceding story. This is well known within the Israelite story. Here the shedding of blood is the means by which forgiveness of sin is effected. That's clear as daylight. That's the Mosaic worship institution. And thus the means by which access to a holy God is actually restored. Now we may not understand the plot of this, but this is what the text is talking about. So what about the servant? Is he simply a victim of a divine miscarriage of justice? Not at all. Not according to the text. For we read, he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sins of many and made intercession for transgressors. Now, this is not the action of a victim. This is the action of a participant. These are words of a participant. So what God and the servant is doing, they are doing together. Surprisingly, for the benefit of the many. That's the whole idea. They're doing it together. So the servant death is an expression of a joint venture between God and the servant, to use a modern terminology, a joint venture. The servant is a consenting participant, whatever the reason for this. What strikes the reader is the concept. He bore the sins of many and made intercession. Both words, offering and intercessions, are code words for the existential drama that is being played out between humans of God in the Israelite sanctuary worship. So this is the access, this is the codes, and the code breaking, should I say, manual is actually an understanding of the Israelite worship. Moses explained the meaning of approaching God through an offering by saying, and here we should listen. We have heard it before, we will hear it again. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For as life, it is the blood that makes atonement. We'll not go into the details of this. We'll just listen to one more text from Moses, and he explains further. Thus the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for the sins that you have committed, and you shall be forgiven. The deeper rationale for this kind of thinking we will approach later. For the time being, this is all we need to notice. So how do you, and let's sum that up. How do you get forgiveness, receive forgiveness of sin according to the Mosaic sanctuary worship? How do you get it? You get it through the sanctuary worship. And what is it that provides forgiveness of sin within the sanctuary worship? It's the offering and by priestly intercession. This is, should I say, the meaning of those words. So while the cultic drama continually reminded the worshipper in Israel about the deep existential gap between humans of God that have existed since the beginning, the shedding of blood and life taught them that God has a remedy that can breach the gap between humans of God and then restore full access to God through forgiveness of sin. God has a remedy. That's the idea. The real surprise in the servant text is that the death of the one servant is understood in terms of the sanctuary provision for sin. This is the real new thing in this text. This is like a bombshell. Who had seen that coming in the preceding story? Now, where is it ever mentioned in the preceding narrative that the servant is going to act like this? This is new. What is not new is that the sanctuary worship itself points to the great cosmic drama that erupted in the beginning of the fall story, And the sanctuary ministry teaches loud and clear that without a resolution to these problems, humans have no access to God. This is what the sanctuary taught loud and clear. So the fourth servant text challenges the reader with the idea that the real resolution to the problem is actually provided by the future servant of the Lord. Isaiah is not providing a new teaching regarding atonement and forgiveness of sin. That's not what he's doing. What he's providing is a new application of what Israel already had, the teachings of the sanctuary. This is never heard of before. It is simply radical. This is new. It is indeed a surprise. Who had ever seen this coming in the story? And as we read the preamble, we suddenly understand better what that this is what he has in mind. For he says the following: "So shall he startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouth because of him. For that which had not been told them," I've never heard about that before, "they shall see, and that which they have not heard, they shall contemplate." That means reflect on and think about. If this has been public knowledge, even within Israel itself, this would not have been a surprise. But that's exactly what is going to be according to Isaiah. He's saying it is going to be a surprise. It is as a mystery that is suddenly revealed. A new revelation that will unfold with the coming of the servant of the Lord. Something we haven't heard about before. Something we have not understood before. So Isaiah is actually speaking about something very, very big here. Something that holds a surprise. Something that will even astonish when it happens. Something that's not be fully understood until it actually does happen. Namely, the unfolding of a deep divine secret and plan. Now, it could be tempting at this point to jump to the teachings of the apostles in what we call the New Testament, to get an explanation of what this text means, and then read it in the light of that. But I'll refrain from doing that, because the method that we are applying here is to read Scripture from the front and not from the back. Not that we don't know what is following, but we want to understand the text in the light of what precedes, not in what follows. So what do you see when you look through the biblical telescope? Of course, we have the general promise in the beginning story that someday will undo the work of the serpent, but there is no explanation of how he's going to do it. But with Abraham, the promise will become more definite. The Abraham lens will focus on the covenant that God makes with Abraham, in which he actually promises Abraham that the lost blessing, the lost paradise blessing, will be restored through the descendants of Abraham. So the focus with Abraham is that whatever God has up the pipeline, whatever is in mind for this world, it's coming through the people of Israel. Now, it's a promise that is going to unfold when we come to the Moses lens. That is the Sinai event, when we have the amendment to the Abraham covenant. Here it gets a little clear what God has in mind. And in this, but the amendment to the Abraham covenant also stipulates how the transgression of God's values can be resolved, and how sinners can have forgiveness of sin and enjoy renewed communion with God. This is also part of the lens given by Moses. However, with David and the second great amendment to the Abraham covenant, it takes a very singular focus. Whatever God's purpose is for Israel, its accomplishment will now revolve around the dynasty, the servant within the servant Israel. This is the singular focus in the amendment with David. Finally, the entire compilation of literature, which we know under the name the Book of Isaiah, will actually revolve around the idea of the Davidic kingship promise. Verbally, thematically, and even structurally, the theme regarding the coming great son of David will flow seamlessly into, should I say, the great servant text that we have just been reading. As the one whose death is presented as divine means of resolving the human sin problem, and which will secure the restoration of human communion with God. This is actually radical. It's astonishing. It's new, it's surprising, and it is startling. No one had seen that coming in the Israelite narrative before. It is actually like a ticking bomb, waiting to explode at the right moment. But Isaiah hasn't finished yet, for the servant text not only speaks about the servant's rejection, the servant's humiliation, and the servant's death, but it also speaks about the subsequent acceptance, exaltation, and life of the servant. So the idea of the servant's death is not the end of the story. It is the end of the beginning of the story. A beginning that will be even more astonishing when we read the rest of the text. Therefore, we have called the next presentation the victorious one.